Okay, so on the board, I have written down essentially the list of models of computation that you very know, to which I have added partial recursive functions, so the computable functions that we've discussed in class on the natural numbers, and deterministic Turing machines that were our starting point on the course. And you see there's some color coding going on. Now, because the variables have all been presented very nicely, I don't need to talk you too much through the details of each one, but you might get some idea what the color coding is, or you might have some idea what the color coding is already. So the green ones, these are models of computation. They're perfectly physically realistic. We can realize a finite automaton in the real world. There are lots of realizations of finite automata of various sorts, but they're weaker than Turing machines. We saw that, and we saw that with push-down automata. So these are realistic models of computation. Weaker than TMs. And then we have a whole lot of blue models: cellular automata, lambda calculus, string rewriting systems, counter register machines, which is a whole family of classes of models. We saw the partial recursive functions, deterministic TMs. And as we've seen, these are all models of computation that are equivalent in a suitable sense for each model to the Turing machine model. So they're again all realistic models of computation. Realistic models equivalent to TMs. Then the orange ones, non-deterministic, probabilistic Turing machines and quantum computation, these were also shown to be equivalent to Turing machines. Only there's some slight differences. The non-deterministic is not so intended as a realistic model of computation in some sense. You don't actually imagine that you're going to run all possible paths through a non-deterministic Turing machine. But you can do, because you can simulate them on a deterministic Turing machine, but there's a loss of efficiency there. And also with quantum computation, actually, although this wasn't so much emphasized in the presentation we had, there was plenty to present about quantum computation as it is. Quantum computation, even the more general models of quantum, so what was in the presentation was that quantum computation subsumes Turing computation, but in fact, quantum computation itself, quantum Turing machines can again be simulated by ordinary Turing machines, but with a loss of efficiency, conjecturally. So probabilistic Turing machines, well, it's not, they can also be. But the point of these orange ones is, in some sense, they're all equivalent to Turing machine models, but there's some issue about whether the simulation by ordinary Turing machine models is with a loss of efficiency or not. We don't know any of the answers definitively, but the conjectural situation is with probabilistic ones, there's a simulation that involves no loss of efficiency. With non-deterministic and quantum computation, simulation by ordinary Turing machines necessarily does involve a loss of efficiency. Those are conjectures. So these are realistic models of equivalent to TMs. So here, simulated by Turing machines with no loss of efficiency. what this means, I mean, the way mathematicians interpret this as there's a polynomial, the amount of time taken by any of these kind of models can be translated to computation by a Turing machine with potentially a polynomial blow-up. There are some other issues I'm not mentioning here, but in the counter-register machines, they're not a good model of space usage because you can store a very large natural number in a single counter. So you need to, if you want to talk about space usage, you need to be careful with how you use counter-register machines. If one wanted to be really, really careful about the color coding, there'd be lots of other color codes that one would need, because also when I say there's a realistic model of computation, well, we believe it's physically realistic, but actually nobody really knows how to build a proper quantum computer at the moment. So that's an enormous research project, as you probably know. But anyway, the point of the orange color code is these can be simulated by TMs, by deterministic TMs, but possibly there's a change of efficiency involved. There might be a loss of efficiency. So in probabilistic computation, we believe there is no loss of efficiency, but we can't prove it. In the other cases, we believe there is, but we also can't prove that. And finally, there are the red models. So I've inverted the order here. In fact, I wished that I'd put them in this order when the presentations were taking place, because hypercomputation follows more naturally on from the previous ones. And the point of hypercomputation is that it's intended to be a sort of realistic model of computation, but in a science fiction reality. So the sort of science fiction reality you have is where you can do, for example, these Zeno steps, these Zeno computations where each twice as quick as the previous step, so you get faster and faster, and you take a finite amount of time to do an infinite number of steps. And actually, there's a bit of literature on people presenting preposterous physical models for hypercomputation. So the sort of, I mean, if you know some things about, so general relativity, there are actually some very funny models one can have of general relativity, where one has something called closed time-like loops, which is a loop through space-time that goes back, so close a loop through space-time, so basically time can repeat itself. And you know, there are a couple of academic papers in which people present models of hypercomputation that exploit a closed time-like loop in space-time to perform an infinite number of steps in a finite amount of time. So what I mean, my take on this is that hypercomputation is kind of a fun thing to think about, but it's not physically realistic. That's science fiction at best. So these are not realistic models. And the reason I would have inverted them is because actually the non-uniform models, so these are of computation on arbitrary length inputs, because they have this feature that you have essentially a different model for each length of input. But nonetheless, often it's important mathematically to model computation on fixed length inputs. And the point of these uniform models is one can get some quite good mathematical leverage by proving combinatorial properties of such models, as we saw, for example, with the proof of the number of comparisons that are used in a sorting algorithm using the decision tree model of computation. But nonetheless, it's not intended to be a realistic model of algorithm, meaning an algorithm that will work on an input of arbitrary size. And lastly, I'm missing from this what we've got two of in front of us, the modern computer. And the point is, these are all models of mathematical models of computation, or families of mathematical models of computation. A real-world computer is not a model at all. It's an actual physical object. There's no question about it being realistic. It is actually real life. We actually have these physical things, but it's not trying to be a model of computation. But I agree with the thesis that was expounded by the three people presenting the modern computer, which was that actually if one wants to mathematically model computation as done on a modern computer, the Turing machine is not a bad model. And in many ways, it's more appropriate than finite automaton. Anyway, what we're interested in this course is essentially the notion of algorithm and the notion of what it means for something to be computable. So we want mathematical theory of this. So we want mathematical models. We want them to be realistic. So we want to stick to everything apart from the red. So let's draw an orange line above the red. And then the amazing thing is, as Matej said in the last presentation of the Church-Turing thesis, the amazing thing is that all the models of computation, they all the realistic ones enjoy this property that they can be simulated by Turing machines. So a Turing machine, this notion that was developed by Alan Turing in the 1930s, is apparently as powerful as any physically realistic model of computation, and more powerful than some that are known to be weaker. So Turing actually, if you've looked at Turing's original paper, which I put in the first lecture, I put it on the course webpage, there's a good argument for why Turing machines are a realistic model of computation. So Turing, in arguing that, clearly believed in what is now known as the Church-Turing thesis. It's rightly attributed to Church as well, because Church, when he proposed lambda calculus, he explicitly made the thesis that the lambda calculus was sufficiently powerful without a good argument for it, but he explicitly came up with the thesis that the lambda calculus should be sufficiently powerful to capture any reasonable algorithm. And he was right, and he was right about that. And all this work that was done subsequently, the work on these models has been done since the 1930s, going up to quantum. The models of quantum computation were developed as late as either maybe the late 1980s, I think, was when people started investigating these models. So they're relatively recent, and they've all essentially reinforced the Church-Turing thesis, which is that the Turing machine models the correct notion of what it means for a problem to be computable, or what an algorithm is. So one can state the Church-Turing thesis in many ways. Matej, in his stated it with respect to functions on the natural numbers. I don't remember how I formulated it in the notes. I could look now, they're just there, and I could write out what's in the notes. But I want to write it now in the way that seems to me appropriate to formulate it after all the presentations we've seen. So Church-Turing thesis. One okay version of it is that any physically reasonable model, one could say of the notion of algorithm, but I'm going to say of computation. But by that, I mean essentially the same thing as of the notion of algorithm. Can be simulated by a Turing machine. Let's try TM, and then we get it on one line. So this is the Church-Turing. I missed out the word thesis. And the evidence for it is fact that nobody's been able to come up with an example in the course of the 80 years, essentially, since the 1930s, when people were first considering such models, plus the good in favour of elaborated on his arguments subsequently. Right, so I don't want to say much more. I'm going to end with a statement at some point in about 10 minutes' time, which I think is important. But before that, the main thing, so in the notes, I talk a little bit about efficiency and how notions of efficiency complicate this picture. But I think we can leave that to the side for this course, because this course is not so much about efficiency, it's about just whether we have an algorithm that will ultimately give us the result if we're very, very patient. So what I do want to talk about is how the Church-Turing thesis impacts on us. You know, so what effect does it have about working with the notion of computability? Do we actually make use of it in practice? And actually, if you read books on computability theory, when people they consider the models, these various models of computation, all books present enough, show their equivalent, and then you go off and you start just looking at computability theory more abstractly. We've understood now, we've got many models that realize it, and we can now just have a more informal approach to computability. And people invoke the Church-Turing thesis to justify this approach. So, so let me sort of outline how that's done. So in practice, people working will say something's computable, something isn't computable, invoke the CT thesis in mathematical work when they're talking about computability. And there are two different ways that people do it. And you see this, you see many examples of this if you read textbooks. So they do it in two different ways. One's a positive way, let's see, a positive context. The positive context is if you want to prove that something is computable, if you want to prove something is computable, I mean, if you go back to the Turing machine model, you need to give a Turing machine. If you go to the partial recursive functions, you need to justify that it's a partial recursive function. We've done plenty of these kinds of arguments, and we very quickly went from giving very concrete Turing machines to high-level arguments that we could in principle construct a Turing machine if we did enough work, but we just convinced ourselves we could do that. We can now go even a step further. We could forget Turing machines altogether. If the Church-Turing thesis is right, it's enough to just give something that we can clearly recognize as an algorithm. It doesn't need to be in any particular model, just as long as it's a set of precise steps that we can carry out. So simply give an informal algorithm, doesn't need to conform to any particular definition of algorithm. We can give an informal algorithm and then say, hence, the problem we're solving with our informal algorithm is computable because there's an informal algorithm for it. Therefore, it's also Turing machine computable because, you know, we're convinced that. Maybe I should actually add something to the Church-Turing thesis and captures any reasonable notion of algorithm. I'm sorry, that doesn't quite flow as a sentence. But I already said any physical reasonable model that I was including in that any notion of algorithm. Sorry, it's been a long day, as we all know, so that's fine. So we get an informal algorithm. That informal algorithm is kind of, we have a way of computing it, so we've got some model of computation in mind, doesn't need to subscribe to a particular one of these fixed class of models, but nonetheless, as long as it's a precise algorithm, then we should be able to compute it on a Turing machine. So then, if this is a reasonable notion of algorithm by the CT thesis, we can compute it. Assuming it's true, we can compute it on a Turing machine. Okay, so people often do that. You get an informal algorithm and you say, so by the Church-Turing thesis, it's computable. And that's okay. And this is what I call an inessential use of the CT Church-Turing thesis. It's inessential that we don't really need to use the Church-Turing thesis here. It's just laziness. There's no actual mathematical necessity to invoke the Church-Turing thesis. If we pulled our sleeves up and got down to work, then we wouldn't actually be able to construct the Turing machine ourselves. And we've done, by the time one's been through all these proofs of these things, for any informal algorithm you come up with, you're basically, by the time you've understood all these equivalences, you'll basically know what to do in order to do that. So there's never any sort of real need for the Church-Turing thesis to do that. It's just convenient. Where the Church-Turing thesis is really essential is the negative context. And this is when we want to prove something is non-computable, or uncomputable, incomputable. Well, it's not computable anyway. To prove something is not computable. And if you remember going back to lecture 1, proving problems were non-computable was the main motivation I gave, and historically a main motivation for developing the model. To solve a particular problem, namely showing that Hilbert's and Scheiden's problem was not computable. For that, he needed a mathematical model of computation. So here, we prove this using a specific model, e.g. TMs. And for example, we proved that the language L accept, or in the exercise class, the halting problem, was not computable in the sense there exists no Turing machine. There does not exist a Turing machine that solves that problem. But we want to understand something more general from this. We don't want to just know there is no Turing machine that solves this model. We believe that this non-computability has a deeper meaning, a more general meaning, which is that there is no algorithm. However we understand algorithm, there is no algorithm that solves this problem. So we then invoke the Church-Turing thesis in an essential way to infer there is no algorithm of any reasonable sort. The reasonable sort. Okay, so I hope that distinction is clear to you. So Church-Turing thesis allows us to kind of go from a specific model to the notion of informal algorithm in two directions. When we do that to show something is computable, we don't really need the Church-Turing thesis, because we can always use a specific model instead. And we make a negative claim, we want for that negative claim to have the carry the full weight that we want it to carry. We do really invoke the Church-Turing thesis. So it's kind of remarkable that we can do that. And it's really remarkable here. It's remarkable that this notion, which sounds like a sort of philosophical notion of what it means for something to be computable, has such a clear-cut mathematical solution. So then the questions are, so the Church-Turing thesis, so hopefully there's enough evidence to believe it. Hypercomputation talk, the last presentation was saying we know the Church-Turing thesis is true. I think that's a bit strong. We don't actually, we believe it's true. Most people do, but it's somehow it's a thesis. It's not something we certainly don't have a proof of it. But somehow we believe it's true because of all the evidence, which I now rubbed off. But anyway, all the evidence that it is true, and we don't have any really plausible alternative to the Church-Turing thesis. So there's essentially all reasonable models that are sufficiently powerful have turned out to be equivalent to the Turing machine model. So the thing I want to end with is what I like about this is the following statement, which I think makes the Church-Turing thesis almost unique in mathematics, or maybe even unique in mathematics, which is, to me, the Church-Turing thesis, if true, which we believe it is, gives a precise mathematical answer to what I view as a fundamentally what is an algorithm? What is a precise set of instructions that one can give, that one can communicate to somebody else to be carried out as a method of sort of precise recipe for computing a solution to a problem? So that seems like a philosophical question, and almost uniquely, we have, I think in this case, we have a mathematical answer that's precise. Okay, we can't prove it because it's not a mathematical question, it's a philosophical question. But it's a precise answer, and it's basically widely accepted, and there isn't really any other plausible answer that can be given to this question. So this answer, it's not like one of these philosophical questions that you could take this point of view or some other point of view. This is the only reasonable answer that this question is known to have. Good. Well, that was short, hopefully. But I mean, that last part was short. Everyone's done a great job today. It's been a really good afternoon, I think. So thank you for your presence here. And we go back to the usual timetable next week.